for the invitation. My name is Kathy Baylis. I'm an agricultural economist who recently moved from the University of Illinois to UC Santa Barbara. And I want to talk a little bit about kind of uses of machine learning in agricultural economics, but I'm going to cheat a little bit because agricultural economics is basically it's basically a form of applied micro. And so I'm going to draw a little bit from some work that's also in environmental econ, and I give a couple examples that are also in from development economics. In just a second, I just need to figure out, there we go. All right, how to switch this to presentation view. All right, so I should note this is based on some joint work with a couple of colleagues from the University of Bonn, Thomas Heckeley and Hugo Storm. And we've basically, the three of us have tried to do a bit of a deep dive in machine learning the last couple of years, so we can understand it a little bit better ourselves. Okay, so why agricultural economics, and why might there be some particularly useful places for machine learning in this space? And as I said, basically, we're applied microecon folks. But quite often we are dealing in spaces where we care about linkages between human and possibly natural systems, environmental systems, maybe even kind of mechanical systems if you're worried about, say, a nuclear power plant operator and how their decisions affect kind of air pollution. Then you kind of need to know, we basically care about the outputs of those other systems, but those systems are non-economic. And again, easiest example might be that we care about what a farmer's crop choice under uncertainty, but to really understand that question, we need to understand how various weather events affect crop yields. Right, and we're not agronomists, so we don't come in with strong priors about those other systems. We try to learn a bit about them, but again, it's really trying to build in some of those outputs of those other systems. It could be human health, for example, systems into the behavioral models that we're more comfortable with. It also quite often means combining sort of socioeconomic data with, say, environmental data that come at very different spatial and temporal scales. And there's places where machine learning can be helpful for that. There's also large problems of heterogeneity in these kind of questions. Again, not unlike many, many other questions in economics, but particularly when you imagine lots of, say, environmental differences from farm plot to farm plot, region to region, that we want to take into account, and machine learning can be helpful for that. We also have sort of situations where we're really interested in multiple outputs of some production function, say. And this is big in agriculture, right? I mean, there's basically no farm that is a single output entity. They all have multiple outputs. We care about how those outputs and decisions around inputs to produce those outputs interact. And this is, again, a place where sort of having these sort of more flexible functional forms can be useful. So, okay, why can machine learning help possibly in some of these places? Well, one thing is, I think over the last 3 days, you've heard a lot about various machine learning methods, and I'm hoping you're convinced now that machine learning is very good at prediction, in particular, these kind of very nonlinear predictive models. Well, and there's some cases where we care about prediction in and of itself, and I'll walk through a couple examples of that. Having those kind of good predictions can sometimes allow us to take very unstructured data, think satellite imagery, for example, here, or cell phone data, and extract information in the form of a prediction from those data. Okay, and I'll give a quick example of that and a couple other citations. There's some cool stuff happening there. It means that it allows economists to basically try and get access to data in places and in locations that we might not have had it before. Because machine learning is good with predictions, we can use it to predict, say, counterfactuals, to get sort of estimates of treatment effects. If you've got a selection problem and that selection itself is highly nonlinear, and you could also use machine learning to try and predict that selection. There's also places where people use machine learning to select instruments. So if you've got, say, a bunch of instruments coming from some biophysical model, and we're kind of agnostic about which of those instruments matter. Say you've got, you know that slope matters, but you don't know if it's a 1 to 2 degree slope that matters versus a 5 to 6, or it's a 27 to 35 degree slope that matters. These are places where machine learning can be helpful. Another place is trying to figure out what are the appropriate groupings over which we want to explore treatment heterogeneity. And this is important because if left to our own devices, sometimes we might have a tendency to kind of pick groupings that give us results that we think make sense and have lots of statistical significance. And using a more algorithmic approach can sometimes tie us to the mast a bit and make and sort of allow, but at the same time, will still allow us to explore a kind of a full range of heterogeneity that we might not have anticipated before doing the base analysis. And I assume Stefan, who's going to be talking after me, has done a lot of work in that area. So I'm going to talk about an example and leave the gory details to him. And lastly, again, machine learning can handle these multi-input, multi-output models. I'm going to try and give a couple examples here, some from my own work, narcissistically, and some from other people's work that I think is quite cool. And just to give you a sense of, again, where these methods are being used and how they're being used in sort of agricultural and environmental economics. And if there's some chance I won't get to the multi-input, multi-output model if I'm running short on time, but if we do, it'll show you sort of some I think novel stuff in that space. But first, there's a number of places where prediction may be important in and of itself. And I'm going to just give a couple examples of places where, at least from a policy standpoint, we actually would like to have a good prediction. I'm going to focus in on the first paper here, the working paper where we're using machine learning to predict food insecurity. And the idea here is that if you do that well, you could mobilize food aid or other interventions in time to try and keep people from going into famine, right? So this is a place where predict forecasting, doing good, accurate forecasts is really important. You could also imagine a place where we wanted to predict future deforestation, say in the Amazon. If we knew sort of where and when different parcels would be likely to be under threat, we could target interventions, target either increased monitoring, increased enforcement, other kind of payments for ecosystem services, sort of interventions to try and mitigate that threat. Another place where we might care about sort of prediction is predicting crop yields. Now, might care about that in terms of predicting food insecurity, or we might care about that as an input into another economic model. I mean, maybe, for example, we want to understand how weather shocks affect conflict, for example. There's been a bunch of work done in that space. Well, we want to know what weather shocks matter, and if we think the mechanism is weather shocks through agricultural output, that's the mechanism to conflict, then sort of having kind of a good prediction of that first piece could be quite important. And we know the link between weather and crop yields is nonlinear, and there's lots of interactions, and it's complex, et cetera, et cetera. And so probably a simple linear model is not going to be great. Okay, so predicting food insecurity here. One of the tricks with predicting food insecurity, I mean, you can imagine this is going to be a kind of highly nonlinear setting where lots of stuff could matter. There's also an additional kind of trick in that the people who are truly food insecure, and these are from our data, which is from food insecure, sort of, and these are the folks we care most about predicting, are thankfully a relatively small sliver. That's good, and that we're glad it's not a large swath of the population. On the other hand, we're stuck in this situation where we're trying to predict a rare event. And so probably the simple predictive model that says nobody is really truly food insecure is going to be highly accurate, but not useful, right? So we want to try, and we care about recall here. We care about trying to be able to identify those folks maybe a little less than overall predictive accuracy. So what we do is we use some methods from machine learning that are basically trying to use some tricks to kind of try to balance the sample a little bit more through either kind of upscaling or creating simulated data that are similar to our households that are severely food insecure. And then we use a bunch of existing survey-based data to try and predict food insecurity. I won't go necessarily into the details. The quick thing to note here, if you look at sort of the recall using the kind of logistic curve versus the recall using machine learning, is we're getting much higher recall rates using machine learning, but our accuracy is not doing that much worse, with some exceptions, particularly Tanzania, sort of the food consumption score, we end up losing a fair bit of accuracy, but mostly we're not losing much accuracy, but gaining a lot on recall, which means we're identifying those food insecure households. Okay. Here's a picture of that. So if, a lot of the humanitarian groups take these food security measures and split them into categories of sort of highly food insecure, again, that pie chart, essentially, the highly food insecure, borderline, or fine. If we use our models to predict those categories, these are the error maps that come out. So this is for just one of the years that we're looking at, 2014. The big red diamonds are places where we're doing a really bad job of predicting, i.e. we're predicting folks are absolutely fine when they're actually highly food insecure. So we really want to avoid those. We'd also like to avoid the sort of yellow circles, which are saying that households are sort of one category better off than they actually are. So we care particularly about, again, this sort of over prediction, saying people are more food secure than they are. And you'll notice sort of on the left-hand side of the graph there, that's our logistic sort of bog standard logistic regression. We're missing a bunch of folks, and we're missing them in the bad direction, saying that they're more food secure than they are. On the right-hand side there, we're using, this is machine learning with an oversampling method, and we're doing much better. You can see we're getting a lot more of those areas correct. In particular, we're avoiding those places where we were over predicting their food security status. So again, we know machine learning is good for prediction. Maybe it's not a surprise it's doing well in this kind of context. I wanted to kind of highlight the fact that there's these additional tricks that we can also use to deal with places where we're trying to predict rare events. This makes sense because machine learning thought a lot about things like trying to identify fraud and other situations where it's the rare events that matter. Okay. Well, that's predicting food insecurity, but we're kind of cheating because we're using existing survey data on a whole bunch of information, including people's assets and all sorts of stuff. Well, normally we don't have that, right? Not on a day-to-day basis. So a number of other authors who've done some really cool work. There's this group out of Stanford in particular that's been focusing a lot on this, is to say, can we predict some of those inputs, right? Some of those so-called feature variables using, say, satellite imagery or other kind of novel data sources. And so there's several papers out there now that are using satellite imagery to predict poverty and asset measures, et cetera. We take that same idea and again, trying to use satellite imagery to predict essentially the asset measures we have in these survey data, and then combine those predicted asset measures with other data that we can get from secondary sources that are updated regularly, like local prices, and say, all right, if we put those things together, can we improve our food security prediction? And the punchline is yes. The reason I wanted to kind of mention this work that's very much in progress is that it's I think this sort of shows where machine learning can really allow us to make use of get access to or make use of novel data sources and combine them. So combining those kind of satellite imagery data with remotely sensed data, with survey data, and get something that's better. And it allows us, in short, to predict. So the cool deal here is even where we do have asset data, but only for certain survey points, here it allows us to essentially use those survey data to train a machine learning model to then predict assets even in places where we don't have survey data. Right. Anyway, now I want to step back and because again, as sort of applied micro people, a lot of what we do is sort of causal kind of work, and I want to touch on where we could use machine learning for causal estimation. Again, leaving all of the sort of the heavy lifting for Stefan Wager. I just want to walk through some examples of where some of these techniques are being used currently in agricultural and environmental economics. And one of the first places, it's one of the most obvious places where one might want to use machine learning for causal estimation is using its predictive capacity to predict a counterfactual. And there's I really like this paper by Fiona Burlig and a bunch of colleagues. And the trick that they've got is that they've got a randomized control trial on school energy, and sort of, standard, nicely designed. Normally we set this up in a standard differences and differences kind of framework and throw in a bunch of fixed effects and we're done. Part of the trick is that the energy use that they're interested in as their outcome variable is screamingly nonlinear, right? It varies minute by minute. I mean, at 3 p.m., energy use in the school drops substantially. Not a surprise. Holidays, it also drops substantially. Weekends. So there's time of day, or day of the year, and then it's also affected by the usual variety of things like the weather. Is it really hot? Do you need to turn on the air conditioning? Is it cold? Do you need to have, is it a school that's using electric heat, et cetera, et cetera. So long story short, they have this counterfactual that's highly nonlinear. And although they can get at a lot of this using sort of increasingly complicated fixed effects in a kind of standard diff and diff setup, they find that their results are not that stable when they do that. So it's really, they're really sensitive to the kind of fixed effects kind of setting, or what combination of fixed effects they're using. So what they do instead is they basically take the treatment units pre-treatment and use that that information to train a model that would predict the counterfactual for those same treatment units post-treatment. They compare that prediction for the treatment units post-treatment to the prediction for the control units post-treatment, and as you would guess, those differences are essentially zero. There's essentially no difference from the randomized treatments post-treatment, the counterfactual of those versus the control units post-treatment, which kind of gives you some faith that this seems to be making sense. Then they take the difference between that counterfactual estimation. So that's, this is not their actual data. These are not their actual data. This is a sort of heuristic to try and describe what they're doing. But you can imagine they're taking that light blue segment of the in-sample predictions, using that same model to forecast out for the counterfactual, that's the dark blue lines. Then they compare that against what they're actually observing in the data. And they take that difference, that gap, and that's essentially their estimated treatment effect. They then dump that and put that into a fixed effects regression to sort of control for a bunch of stuff, like school fixed effects and stuff like that. So straightforward idea. They can do this because it's an experimental setting, so they're not worried about confoundedness and things like that. What's kind of nice, so here on panel B here, is they're estimating sort of the energy savings for the treated versus the untreated group. The treated group is a line in blue, versus the untreated is that sort of distributional line in gray. And for untreated, as you can tell, it's centered pretty tightly around 0, which is exactly what you'd expect, right? There shouldn't be any treatment sort of effect for those schools that were not treated. At the same time, they are seeing the significant treatment effect for at least a large number of the schools that were treated. And that's kind of what they're drawing out there in terms of the panel A, as you can sort of see if their expected savings versus their sort of estimated savings, that you're seeing, you know, an upward sloping relationship there. So places where we expect to see savings, schools where we expect to see savings were they're estimating savings. This highlights sort of another nice aspect of this approach is they can actually get treatment effects for each school, which again allows you to later explore a bunch of heterogeneity stuff, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Basically, but for them, or at least for me, the punchline out of their paper is not only getting sort of results that are compelling and kind of make sense, they're also screamingly stable. So kind of no matter what they compare when they're looking at sort of the kind of placebo regression equivalence of looking at, again, post-treatment control units versus predictions of the counterfactual from the treated units, those are all right around 0. Versus the kind of different way that they're cutting the comparison of the actual data versus their prediction. Sort of no matter how you cut that data, whether you're comparing it sort of the treatment to control, treatment post-treatment to sort of counterfactual, et cetera, they're getting very, very sort of straight up kind of diff setting, but again, using those predicted counterfactual. The estimates really don't change much at all. Versus, there's a link to the paper in the slides, which I'm happy to share. If you look at sort of their standard diff and diff fixed effects regressions, again, those the estimates of treatment do move a fair bit. So, long story short, they would argue that in this case where you've got this highly nonlinear counterfactual, and sort of a nice experimental design using machine learning methods to kind of predict that counterfactual can help. Another place where people have used machine learning in agricultural economics, environmental econ, is sort of instrument selection. And I admit when I first read about this, it's sort of like, you know, if you have the problem of too many instruments, I'm like, I don't usually have that problem. But in some cases you might. It's particularly in the case where you've got a bunch of instruments that are coming from some biological or geophysical process, and we don't know what the right instruments are, particularly like, again, the example if slope of land determines deforestation, you know, we may not know exactly sort of what slope is correct, or say slope of land determines where you build a hydroelectric power plant or dam. I mean, again, if we don't know exactly what slope matters in that context, this is maybe a way to use machine learning to pick the appropriate sets of instruments. I'm going to talk a little bit about the paper by sort of Nick Ryan and co-author that's using machine learning to pick instruments for costs of groundwater. But other places where this has been used is places where folks we're trying to get a sense of weather shocks and whether shocks had affected health of a prior generation, and those were large, and so there's a large number of potential instruments, and so they use, again, some kind of in this case a lasso to pick out which instruments seem to matter. Other place where we've made use of it is where we've got sort of a whole bunch of potential spatial lags, and we don't know sort of what's the right spatial extent that matters. And we can use again, same approach at lasso to sort of try to identify what's going on. So, quick question, are there any uses of machine learning for farm labor or estimating rural to urban immigration? That's a great question. I haven't seen any. I've heard some folks talk about possibly trying to use it for migration and try to predict migration, but I've not seen that application. Yeah, cool. Anyway, good point. So the paper again I want to focus on here is using a lasso to identify appropriate instruments for basically it's well depth, and well depth for groundwater is highly correlated with essentially the cost of water, because obviously the deeper you go, the more energy it takes to pump that water up. And this is all in the context of massive exploitation of groundwater resources. In particular, they're looking in India and in the state of Rajasthan. And what's interesting from a policy perspective is the way that this is being dealt with now is through a very kind of brute force form of rationing. And the rationing does not come through sort of saying, you get so many liters, you get so many liters. It's coming through, you get so much electricity, you get 6 hours a day of electricity to pump water, no more. So the rationing is coming through electricity that's then used for pumping. And the question these guys are trying to ask is that efficient? Like, you know, how close are we getting to average marginal benefit versus marginal cost of that water? Versus then it's sort of looking at the distributional effects of that kind of rationing regime. And basically the problem is that, well, what they want to estimate essentially is the marginal productivity of water to understand, to again, look at that kind of marginal benefit of water. What they want to do is then use variation in the cost of water for farmers to estimate that marginal productivity. Problem is that well depth, we know the well depth drives cost, but well depth itself is likely endogenous, it's likely related with a whole bunch of other things. So they want to instrument for sort of how deep that groundwater is for an individual farmer based on this groundwater prospects data, which is really talking about the hydrology in that specific setting. And these are data put together by the government of India. But it's got tons and tons of information in there, including sort of aquifer type, you know, the faults, fractures, the rock types and layers at different depths, and all this kind of stuff, and then a bunch of interactions. End up with a lot of potential instruments. And so then they use a lasso to try and select what are the appropriate instruments to predict, again, groundwater depth based on these sort of these pre-existing geological factors. And this is what they get. So on the left-hand side are sort of the actual well depths, and the right-hand side is sort of the predicted. They're not getting all of it in terms of they're missing some of the deepest wells, or they're saying that they're shallower than they actually are. But the variation is pretty darn good using this sort of this highly nonlinear model, and so it gives them a very strong first stage that they then go and use this to try and estimate the marginal productivity of water, and then from that estimate whether this rationing regime seems to be getting marginal costs equal to marginal benefits on average, and then looking at sort of the individual marginal costs versus marginal benefits per farmer. So what they find is, and this is a surprise to all concerned, is that actually this quirky form of rationing is not doing a bad job of getting average costs set to equal to average benefits. So all right, that's kind of neat. However, because this is it's an arbitrary scheme, it's resulting in serious water misallocation between farmers. And by that, I mean, they're allocating too much water to farmers that are less efficient or make less efficient use of that water than to other farmers who can make more efficient use of that water. And if you just sort of, if you actually impose the Pigouvian tax kind of setting in this setting where you're actually trying to figure out the opportunity cost of each liter of water for each farmer, yeah, clearly would make things more efficient, but it would really hurt a lot of these farmers, which is kind of why it would be very hard to move from this, albeit arbitrary rationing system to something that was more kind of economically efficient overall, just because you get a lot of pushback. Okay, so anyway, I thought nice use of machine learning to select instruments. This is sort of one use of machine learning that's probably been done a fair bit, been made use of a bit in agricultural economics, but also in environmental economics, because there are a number of places where we have those physical systems which are suggesting a bunch of instruments or a bunch of variables that probably matter, but we don't know exactly which ones and which interactions, and we know it's nonlinear, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, now I want to barrel on and talk a little bit about, because I want to spend just a little bit of time on this last paper, or second last paper, that it looks at, that uses both sort of counterfactual prediction, but also uses machine learning for treatment heterogeneity. This is it's a recent paper in the AER by Tatiana Deryugina and colleagues. Again, it's looking at the effects essentially of air pollution on health. Okay. Just to tee it up, there's a lot of people who've estimated the effects of air pollution on health. It matters because if we want to know, how much more should we be reducing pollution? What's the marginal benefit of reducing air pollution further? And we also sort of care who would benefit from that. Most of the work so far has been done on larger particulates, just because we tend to have better data on those. But there's a sense that the smaller particulate matters, the PM 2.5s, are actually more hazardous to health. And so we really want to understand that relationship between pollution and sort of health outcomes. Yeah, because again, we think it matters. PM 2.5 is hard to measure. There's far fewer stations that actually measure PM 2.5, which means that a lot of the existing literature suffers from sort of an errors and variables problem, right? So if we have information for this monitor here, and we're looking at this household over here, if we just take this level and apply it to this household, we know that's probably wrong. What other people have done is sort of spatial creaking, just sort of spatial smoothing, essentially, and maybe some kind of try to fit, this monitor has this level, this monitor has this level, sort of smooth between them. Not a bad attempt, but we also know that that's wrong, right? Because there's all sorts of other things that are going to matter. We also know that those stations aren't randomly placed. There's a bunch of kind of issues here that can create issues in terms of measuring air pollution. And just again, to highlight, that's going to be worse for PM 2.5. What these guys have, the other thing that a lot of other papers have done is there's relatively smaller-ish case studies, whereas these guys have data for the entire US, which, and they have this because David Molitor, one of the co-authors, has access to kind of the full Medicare data set. So it's a specific sample of elderly population in the US, but the nice thing is it's close to the universe of the elderly population in the US. Well, yeah. And particularly, they have that geocoded to the zip code level. So not exact coordinates, but they can basically still get relatively granular spatial linkages, as long as they can try and figure out a way of predicting kind of pollution in that zip code in that day. I should note that they have this big swath of data, this huge sample, and they have data on them daily. So they know basically who died at each stage. And they also have a whole bunch of other health information, specifically for the subset who sort of makes use of Medicare, right, for their health services. So cool data, potential to do something really big, and they do, I think. Reason I want to talk about this paper is there's sort of several places where they're making use of machine learning methods, which is neat. And so one of them is, so their innovations in general is firstly to use this instrumental variables approach that's basically using wind direction to predict pollution over the entire US, as opposed to relying on sort of individual monitors. So using the monitors for training, but then sort of then predicting pollution sort of more broadly, and again, basically on wind speed, wind direction, and a whole bunch of other kind of weather variables. The second piece that they do is that as you can imagine, sort of mortality risk is going to be a highly nonlinear function of all sorts of stuff. And so they use a machine learning method to try and predict mortality risk for each of their individuals that they have in their data. Again, to try and predict the counterfactual. So for people who are living in places that have relatively low air pollution, what did their mortality rate look like versus in what would have, for the people living in areas of higher pollution, what would have been their counterfactual if they had lived in a place with lower air pollution. I should note the variation they're using in pollution is sort of short run, because it's dealing with sort of changes in wind direction from the prevailing wind direction. So so they're to try and get around issues of endogeneity, of sort of sorting issues. Okay. Then, so I'm using machine learning in step 2 for prediction, and then they also kind of further use sort of machine learning to try and understand heterogeneity of this treatment effect. Okay. Just a quick picture in terms of the wind direction or the wind direction instrument piece. Now they aren't formally using machine learning here, but they are using sort of some clustering algorithms, of which there are many that come from machine learning. So it's certainly a place where you could use machine learning. They're using a spatial clustering algorithm to kind of lump the monitors into geographic segments where those pollution monitors tend to move together. They then basically then in each of those areas, they try to estimate pollution outcomes from basically wind direction and wind speed and a bunch of other controls. And so again, the intuition here is that, so this is a picture of Boston, is that, you know, if the wind's coming from the ocean, it's going to tend to, the air's going to tend to be much cleaner, versus if it's coming from the southwest, it's going to be dirtier. And so that's the variation they're trying to use to predict essentially pollution exposure and on a day-to-day basis. Then, so that gives them their treatment essentially. And then they're going to try and overlay that against a prediction of life expectancy. And here they've got, part of this is just, they've got this wealth of data from this Medicare data set, which includes a whole bunch of demographics, but also chronic condition indicators, sort of various health-related events, characteristics at the zip code level, the pile of interactions. They basically have something where they have, it's a couple thousand possible variables, or I might be out by an order of magnitude. But it's in the thousands anyway of potential variables. So they have this setting where they want to impose some dimension reduction, but they also have a setting where they know they have this sort of highly nonlinear functional form as well. And so they're going to use machine learning in this context to predict life expectancy. Okay, so they use a couple of different machine learning methods, and essentially all of these variables, features to try and predict life expectancy. They can do that for each cohort in each year, and they can then sort of figure out, all right, given that, we can look at sort of our treatment versus our control, and figure out the life years lost because of exposure to pollution. So they're doing this and then trying to sort of, and then relating that to, again, places where people had more exposure versus less, et cetera. Here's some pictures. So basically, one thing that they found is when they used these machine learning methods, the estimates of the effect of PM 2.5 particulate matter, these small particulates, was a fair bit lower than if they just used a much simpler estimate of life expectancy. So they're just controlling for age and sex. That's that second bar there to the right. As you can see, that their estimates of the treatment effect of pollution is much higher than when they're doing this much tighter control. So that's important. It's still not small, by the way. Those effects are still large, but you would have overestimated them otherwise. Okay, so to give you a sense of estimate. And the thing that they also find in particular is that the biggest benefits, let me flip that around. The largest potential loss in life from exposure to PM 2.5 is happening amongst those individuals who have the least life expectancy, i.e. it's the folks that are already pretty sick that are most subject to potential mortality from pollution. It's maybe not a surprise, but again, but that's, I think, sort of why doing a better control of the life expectancy might be actually reducing those estimates a fair bit, because it turns out it's the folks that didn't have that much life expectancy that have kind of the bigger increase in probability of death from air pollution. Okay, so far they've done they've used this predictive model to kind of predict counterfactuals. Now they want to get into heterogeneity, and I'm going to do a very light touch version of this, just to try and maybe give you a little bit of intuition about what's going on here, and point you to the paper as well as the original methods paper here. And of course, again, there's alternative methods to try and use machine learning for heterogeneity, produced by Susan Athey and Stefan and their co-authors. So here, basically the idea is that you try to estimate, you basically are going to try and predict a conditional average treatment effect for each individual. So given a set of characteristics, what is that treatment effect of air pollution on that individual? Knowing that estimate could well be biased, because the effect's going to be correlated with a bunch of characteristics, some of which you observe, some of which you don't. You can still use that to try and then extract a measure of an unbiased measure of conditional average treatment effect. And then you can look at those conditional average treatment effects by characteristic grouping, essentially. So what characteristics drive big differences in those estimated conditional average treatment effects? That's a very broad brush kind of idea. Let me walk through a couple of this in maybe a little more detail. So the first thing that these guys had to do is take this method, which was designed for an RCT, and apply it to sort of a more quasi-experimental setting, where again, they're using this sort of instrumental variables approach. And one of the things that so basically what they do here is they use their instruments to predict treatment by saying that given the wind speed and wind direction, et cetera, these would be the areas that we expect to be sort of highly treated versus other areas. So, and the people living in those highly treated areas versus other areas. So they do that. Then they sort of split those two treated versus control samples. They take subsamples of each to develop two predictive models. So you're using the treated model to predict essentially probability of death for the treated group, conditioned on all sorts of characteristics. Then you're using sort of the control group, same thing, to predict the probability of death, you then take those models, apply them to a separate subsample, coming again from the treatment and control groups, to get 2 predictions per observation. So each observation will get a prediction of what's their probability, given their characteristics, of death if they were in the treatment group versus if they were in the control group. And essentially the idea here is the difference in those 2 predictions per individual gives you an estimate of the treatment effect of living in a place with more air pollution. And again, they're able to do this sort of by individual by day. So you get a daily probability of death sort of for each individual, sort of assuming that they were in the control group or treatment group. Then the next step is you basically do the same idea, but to estimate propensity score. So given people's characteristics, what's the probability that they're living in a polluted area in that day versus not, okay? And then you put those together and run a regression, specifically a weighted regression, to try and get this linear estimate of conditional average treatment effects, okay? There's the math. Again, happy to try to go through the details, but also, again, the next speaker knows this stuff way better than I do. Okay, so basically the steps are, we're going to predict outcome for our treated and our control groups, and we're going to predict propensity score using machine learning methods and for both those steps. From those, we're going to estimate, get an estimate of the conditional treatment effect by individual, and then we can look at sort of the characteristics associated with the biggest differences in those average treatment effects. And so, and that's where the heterogeneity piece comes in. Okay? So here's just this sort of suggests there is a fair bit of heterogeneity. Then we look at those characteristics that are associated with different levels of estimated treatment. And just to note here, so that red line is saying that's the average estimated treatment effect. But you can see it's very different for different groups. So groups that have various forms of heart disease, lung cancer, et cetera, tend to be affected much more by being in places with air pollution versus not. Okay. So I like this paper a lot. It's very clever. It's very detailed. It's also kind of a nice example of a paper where they're sort of using machine learning in several places. They could even use it in their instruments. They aren't, because they don't need to, but that it sort of suggests another place where if you have this kind of setting, you could maybe use machine learning there as well. The punchline of the paper, though, is that current levels in the US of PM2.5 are harmful to the elderly. And the benefits of reducing PM2.5 are large monetarily, even if sort of the biggest effects are of people who don't have who have relatively short life expectancies, even without the pollution, okay? So but the effects overall are still big enough that it's probably would make some sense to reduce pollution further. They note that sort of a big caveat to what they're doing is they're looking at this very short-term exposure, so changes in exposure from changes in wind direction, and probably the effects of chronic exposure are much larger, and they can't really speak to that. The other piece that's sort of really that's coming out of their work is to note that simple controls of sort of simple predictions of life expectancy using things like sex and age really doesn't cut it, or will give you sort of much bigger estimates of the effect of air pollution than sort of a much tighter control using a whole bunch of kind of past health history. Okay, and the these effects are really concentrated in the top 25% of the population. And these are folks, again, who have relatively low predicted life expectancy and have a lot of other comorbidities, which we all know about in this context of COVID, right? So a lot of heterogeneity that matters in this context. That said, that doesn't reduce from the message that the overall effect of air pollution, PM2.5 levels are still large. And again, cool paper. All right, if you'll bear with me, and I see there's a question there, I'll come to that just at the end. I want to talk just a little bit about neural networks for policy simulation, just because this is maybe a place that folks haven't seen applications of machine learning in economics as much yet. So, and this is a real Aggie example. It's here. We're trying to use a neural network to evaluate the effect of farm policy in Norway. I'll explain why Norway in just one slide. Why do we care? Well, we care, in particular, we're gonna look at the effect of farm policy on farm structure. Why do we care? Well, quite often farm policy is motivated, agricultural subsidies are motivated by trying to preserve the family farm, right? That we care about farm structure, that there's something inherently desirable about having a certain farm structure out there. And there's been a lot of tweaking of farm policy to try and make sure it's actually, again, it's not going to corporate farms or et cetera, that it's really, you know, doing what it's meant to do in terms of preserving the family farm, however you define it. The trick in why use a neural network? Well, the trick is these policies are, especially in Norway, are wildly complex. So that there are differential subsidies for differential outputs, and each output subsidy has a different threshold. So, and of course that's, but at the same time you have a single farm that's producing all these different outputs and they're trying to sort of respond to all of these slightly different incentives. It's complex. And the nice thing about the neural network here is it can take these sort of multiple inputs and sort of multiple kind of marginal and average subsidies over these various different outputs and look at how that's affecting not just any single output, but outputs in general, okay? So, the farm policy work, yes, there's a working paper on the farm policy work. There's oops, I actually didn't, I will add a link to that before I send the slides there, but if you, it's in the references, so anyway. So, why Norway? Well, Norway's kind of, firstly, they have great data, individual farm level data that are all geocoded. So that also gave us a sense to also look at sort of spatial effects of these decisions, et cetera, et cetera. And again, it's sort of, if you want to look for complex agricultural policy, Norway is the place to go. Lots of regional heterogeneity, both by design in the policy, because there's different regional targets that are built into the policy as well as just driven by environmental, various environmental conditions, right, that vary a fair bit. Producer support estimates, right, are a proxy of trying to get a sense of how much farmers are supported by the government financially, and Norway is like the third highest after Iceland and Korea. So complex farm policy, very interventionist farm policy. The way it works is that the government negotiates with the farmers union to make updates to the policy each year. And farmers are then paid based on the new policy, but on their prior year's activity level. Oops. Okay, so we're going to be modeling out a specific change that happened in the policy between 2014 and 2015, and basically what they were doing was they were changing sort of the subsidies per head to make them a little bit, well, to basically have larger lumps. So we basically have, we're moving from kind of having different marginal subsidies for if you have a 1 to 50 sheep versus 51 to 100 sheep versus 101 to 200 sheep. They're basically now having a single kind of subsidy per sheep for anybody from the size of 1 to 100, and then another one for farms that are over 100 sheep. Okay. Again, these are all kinks, right? So there's a lot of kinks in these policies. We also think, by the way, so you think marginal subsidies might matter, being good economists. We also think, though, average subsidies might matter in as much as they might help with any liquidity constraints and sort of other kind of inducing kind of farm investment, that kind of stuff. And so we want to look at the effect of both of those things. And what we're going to use is this recurrent neural network. And what's nice about this model is that it basically allows you to model past events, sort of kind of autoregressive processes in an incredibly flexible way. So it's not just that last year might affect you more than the year before, et cetera, and some kind of decay that we usually have in our AR sort of models. Here we could say that here this is picking up the fact that maybe the fact that you did something 10 years ago might actually affect the probability of what you're doing today. So maybe, for example, you got out of dairy production 10 years ago. It's not just important that you weren't doing dairy last year. The fact that you had been doing it 10 years ago might still have an effect in that you might still have some equipment, or you might still have some of the knowledge that you might be more likely to go into dairy today, for example. And this basically flexibly, this approach flexibly picks up which of the past activities matter from various different stages. But it also can figure out sort of what stuff doesn't matter, which turns out to be very important as well. So again, each cell sort of is encoding past information, and the model's learning sort of which information and which coding is sort of the most important. Punchline, again, we don't need to specify a specific lag structure. And the other nice thing is the lag structure can vary across variables. So for some things, what you did 10 years ago might really matter. For other things, what you did last year might matter, et cetera. So you have different lags for different variables. That's sort of the, again, quick hand-wavy version. And what we want to do is sort of simulate out several policy options, look at the actual sort of this actual shift from 2014 to 2015, and use it to kind of predict out what if we further changed the kind of the way that subsidies were allocated to either just a flat scheme or to a scheme where we only subsidize sort of the first 100 sheep people have. Okay. Again, whether you are interested in sheep or not, part of the point of this is, and so we've got this change, we're trying to simulate this change in sheep policy and look at how it affects sheep. Firstly, the predicted number of sheep.
I guess we are losing Catherine, and okay, you are back. Okay,
I'm back. Sorry about that. Island Wi-Fi is sometimes a little fidgy. Back to sheep quickly here. So again, what's happening here is this is a simulation for the subsidy where we move to a flat payment regardless of farm size, like flat payment per sheep, I should say, regardless of farm size, versus here's where we're cranking up the subsidy for only the smaller farmers. And depending on how many sheep one had in the prior year, you're going to respond to those changes differently. So if you had lots of sheep in the prior year, and the government moves to this flat subsidy, that's obviously more beneficial for you. Not a surprise, you're going to increase your sheep production. Versus on the flip side, if you're a large sheep producer and the government concentrates the subsidy on smaller sheep producers, you're going to reduce the number of sheep you've got versus the smaller folks are going to generally increase. Notice there seems to be a cut point there at 100. I mean, none of this is a particular surprise. There's sort of some individual cells that one would probably want to try and understand, like, what's going on with these guys. But what's kind of cool is that we're not going in and saying that there needs to be a cut point at 100. We're saying that given this policy simulation, like, this is what our neural network model based on prior changes, responses to subsidies would predict. So it's picking up stuff that seems to make sense in terms of sheep production, and that may not be that exciting on its own. What's, I think, cooler is that when we look at pasture, right? So this is, fodder production. So this is how fodder production would change given this change in sheep subsidy. We also see some kind of logical responses. And we're not forcing a relationship. We're not embedding any kind of relationship between fodder and sheep other than what is seen in the actual training data itself. Right? So here's the idea that if you've got lots of sheep, the government is actually going to is increasing the subsidy going to larger farms. You're actually seeing some of those larger farmers reduce their fodder production, basically because it becomes cheaper for them to buy, to basically go to increase the scale of sheep production, but then to sort of specialize and buy fodder instead of growing it themselves. On the other hand, if you've got sort of this stronger benefit for smaller farmers, they're also going to increase the number of sheep they've got, but they are also at the same time going to increase their fodder production. So it's picking up some heterogeneity in terms of farm size. It's also picking up, again, these sort of co-product effects. For cereals, again, we're picking up some other kind of co-product effects. What you see is with the sort of flat subsidies, you see a bunch of the smaller farmers going into producing slightly more cereals. A lot of them not changing at all. That's a sort of big horizontal line there. Again, versus if you're increasing the subsidy going to smaller farmers, those guys are getting out of cereal production. Again, cereal, sheep may not be your shtick, but what I find really neat here is, at least I as an economist have always been a little bit frustrated about how we try and estimate co-production of things. And here there's this approach that basically is picking up a bunch of these interactions between these co-products without us building any of this in explicitly. Like, we aren't building in some kind of explicit constraints, et cetera, et cetera. It's picking it up. We still, I mean, this is relatively early, early work. There is a working paper again, and I'll drop in the link to that. We also know, like, spatial interactions are going to matter a lot. Like, is there fodder being grown nearby, et cetera, et cetera. That's one place we want to kind of push this. But it's sort of a neat, I think, potential application of these neural network models. All right, stepping back. So I think there's a number of places where machine learning can add to environmental and agricultural economics. In the references, I've got some sites from development economics as well. And basically, places where we want improved prediction, right? Machine learning can be really helpful. That can both get us access to information from novel data sources like remotely sensed data. It can allow us to sort of develop these kind of more complex models that have a whole bunch of nonlinearities built into them. We can also use that prediction to help in terms of causal inference, either predicting counterfactual directly or predicting selection, things like that. The one trick is that when we're applying this to sort of causal identification, it doesn't get us around having a good identification strategy. We're still, I mean, it allows us to estimate some things a little bit more in a nonlinear fashion, but we still kind of need to know, we still need to deal with endogeneity, right? It doesn't solve that problem. Okay. places where it can go, or I think it's going now, is that I think there's a lot of interest in introducing some structure into machine learning models, because there are some places where we do know something about the structure and we don't need to be completely agnostic. And that can make those models more efficient, and particularly more efficient in places where we don't have an infinite amount of data. There's a lot of very, very smart people doing work on the statistical properties of these machine learning models. Again, our next speaker being one of them. And I think there's a lot of cool stuff that's happening there. There's some neat potential with some probabilistic programming options in machine learning. And then the last thing I want to talk about is just that first point, again, is that when we're thinking about these novel data sources that are coming from machine learning algorithms, so think of a lot of weather models out there. The predictions for any particular geolocation are basically coming from a machine learning model. We want to think carefully about the errors embedded in those predictions, because they're probably not classical, right? And we want to worry about sort of how is that affecting sort of our model. So if we're pulling off the shelf output from other machine learning models, I think we also want to think kind of carefully what those models themselves are doing, and might, you know, where are we confident, where are we not? So lots of neat stuff happening in this space. It's happy to answer questions and happy to share a limited set of references in terms of some of these applications. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. We have one question and a couple of questions from email. And are you able to look at the question and answer section, or?
Yes.
Okay.
Ha ha. Oh, excellent. So the question is, have you seen the application of reinforcement learning for agent-based simulation or of agri-food supply chain or tax policy analysis? Sort of is the quick answer. I know that there's some new, very new work that's being done in this by some European colleagues in terms of, again, these sort of using reinforcement learning for ABMs, agent-based models. There's also a whole bunch of stuff using kind of other sort of like local surrogate model approaches and stuff like that from to do sort of upscaling and downscaling of complex models such as agent-based models. So Thomas Hekelai, who's one of my co-authors on this stuff, is doing some work in that space. There's also some kind of, relatedly, there's some new stuff that people are just starting in on using some of these generalized adversarial networks, which is for kind of for simulation modeling, and particularly to generate kind of Monte Carlo style data. I'm still wrapping my head around that, but it kind of makes sense in that those are methods that are very good at kind of mimicking data and data structures out there. And so that instead of sort of programming in an explicit DGP, maybe there are places we might want to use those other methods to sort of pull out data, simulated data, but that has a lot of the same, that embeds a lot of the same characteristics as the actual underlying data that we might want to understand.
Thank you very much. We have a couple of the emails we received, and I'm going to just summarize because we don't have so much time. And one is basically they are asking related to PM 2.5, and there are some satellite-based, very fine spatial scale air quality readings and very high frequency, like hourly basis, like 500 meter radius. They can some companies can provide some machine learning, although these are not station-based readings in terms of the weather data and air quality data. And what they provide really kind of the finer spatial scales and forecasting in terms of these two dimensions. And I was, the questions they're asking, is there any scientific, these companies are basically working with really kind of companies like Uber, like aviation industry. And there are some recent trends, they kind of to use that kind of forecasting from machine learning instead of station-based readings. So is there any kind of the question about the reliability of that kind of the air pollution? Because as you mentioned, PM 2.5 is not easy to find. And do you have any comment on this question?
No, that's great. So the forecasting stuff for PM 10, those models are sort of much further developed, and so there's been much more work using the data from those models in economic analysis, or trying to use them to kind of gut check what's happening on the ground. So there's long story short, the uses of those models for PM10 is much greater. For PM 2.5, my sense is, and I could be wrong, that these models are still pretty new. And part of the trick is that the training data that they're using tend to be coming from urban areas, sort of specific settings. And I think the concern is sort of how well, are we basically building in areas where we're able to predict PM 2.5 really well in certain settings, but not in others, particularly in rural settings, which is kind of the space I work in mostly. So I think there's a lot of potential there, but I think we're sort of pushing in on, are there non-classical measurement errors coming out of those is kind of an important question.
Okay, and thank you very much. It was awesome talk and presentation. And I guess we don't have other questions. And thank you very much again for your time. It was wonderful.
Very, very much my pleasure. Thanks for putting this all together. I'm a happy consumer of what you're putting together as well. So cheers until next time.
Okay, thank you very much again. Now we are going to have our last for today, last speaker, and we are right now, so right now I can,
Welcome, Stefan.
so when you are able to